Hello everybody, this is Fernando for the latest Cryptids and Monsters video. Alright, it is that time. It's time to finally wrap up the final chapter here of the book Occult Investigator, Real Cases from the Files of Ex-Investigations by Bob Johnson. Chapter 11, the ending, the final chapter associated with this great book. I always hate beginnings because I know there's an ending that's always coming, and in this case, here we have this chapter finally ending this really, really good book. I mean, we went from having chapters dedicated to werewolves, to vampires, to ghosts apparently in cafes as well, to hell rats, to even other oddities, including a computer that was alive and so on. So really good book. Again, I'll include the link for it below. That way you can read it for free as much as you want. Check out my other chapters as well. All the previous other chapters. There's one chapter that I did not read that I'm going to provide some information on more on my membership. I might make it viewable here later on, but basically it's a long story as to why I couldn't read it, but it all has to do with YouTube once again and the blockage that they have on certain subjects. But again, if you want that chapter, you can read it here with the link below, or I might just put it there on my channel as an exclusive there too. But in this case, chapter 11 has to do with a ghost strangler. Apparently there's a ghost in this chapter that is haunting a young girl, and this young girl is having this encounter with a ghost who is trying to strangle her. Very frightful stuff when it comes to this. So adieu, parting is such sweet sorrow when it comes to this book. This will be the final chapter here, and then I'll give my own thoughts and opinions on it afterward. Let me know too what you guys think as far as this total encapsulation of this book, all the chapters, what your thoughts were. Love to hear them too. So chapter 11 is called Andrea's Strangler. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that here. What do you say to well-to-do parents who claim their 8-year-old daughter, a privileged child in a private school with every creature comfort and imaginable, is being haunted by the ghost of a deranged strangler? Queries regarding hauntings top the list of calls received by Ex-Investigations. After only 3 months of operation, our office got a haunted house or ghost sighting call at least once a day. A majority of the calls were from people who were possibly very bored, a little loony, or simply paranormal jerky boy telephone pranksters. Savannah and I called the bulk of these potential clients the spook kooks because invariably their stories were almost identical. They would begin with either a haunted house they had spent the night in, or an apparition floating around their house causing all kinds of disturbing and disruptive havoc. Very few of these stories hit a chord. It's usually not what has been experienced, but more the sound of the caller's voice, a frightened, harrowing tone. This is how Stephen and Karen sounded when Savannah got their call one sunny July morning in 1999. Because of her psychic sight, Savannah is more finely aware of the honesty in people's tales. She has a built-in BS meter that's specifically tuned into the paranormal worlds. So in addition to immediately being able to dismiss the crazies, Savannah can go to another level and discern whether a person's claim has some legitimacy. I often thought it was just a matter of her being involved in the occult for so many years that she had naturally developed a wisdom, but on almost all occasions, Savannah's instincts were uncanny. So when she entered my office that morning with a blanched look and told me about the Virginia couple's problem, I knew we had a hardcore haunting on our hands. Stephen and Karen told us at a meeting in their home later that week that they had been extremely happy and fortunate to have been able to buy the house of their dreams in such a good neighborhood in this Virginia suburb, not far from metropolitan Washington, D.C. Both federal government workers, the couple and their 8-year-old daughter, Andrea, were settling into the big gray Victorian house they called the Gray Lady to start their lives on a secure foundation. Stephen explained that the family had relocated from Minneapolis and had looked for months to find just the right house in the right neighborhood with good schools for Andrea. Stephen and Karen took turns flying to Virginia on weekends to do their house hunting months before their transfers came through, but they hadn't been able to find the house they liked and, more important, could afford. We love Victorians, and in the better neighborhoods, the prices were prohibitive, Stephen said. But their luck changed when their broker called and told them that a large Victorian, just their style house, had just become available after the previous family had to move suddenly. It's going to go fast, the broker told Stephen. He advised them to catch the next plane and check it out. The young couple took his advice and made the trip the very next day, checkbook in hand. The house was everything they wanted, and they immediately fell in love. I said to Stephen that the price had to be ridiculous, and the broker just lured us here to rope us in. But to our shock and joy, the house was affordable. We were thrilled, Karen said. But they both knew there had to be a catch somewhere. A beautiful house in a great neighborhood priced at $100,000 under market value. Something had to be wrong, and indeed something was wrong. The broker laughed and explained that the Gray Lady has a silly history of causing strange behavior in its inhabitants. After pressing the broker, Stephen learned that within 18 months' time, 3 families had left the house in the lurch. The broker didn't get into the details, but during their lunch at a local diner, the couple discovered from the diner owner that the father of a prior resident had been committed to a mental hospital after living in the house for only a few months, having suffered a breakdown that was said to be business-related. And the previous family's young son had been arrested and incarcerated for mutilating local animals, forcing that family to leave the neighborhood. Very bizarre, Karen said to the diner owner. Yes, he responded, but it's the choking that gets everyone the most. The choking, Stephen asked, and the owner said, that's right, sir. No one can be in that house for more than a few days without feeling like they're being strangled. No workers, utility people, and especially no one who lives there. Everyone feels like their throat's closing up on them at some point. Some think it has to do with some kind of mold in the house that's making everyone sick, but there's too many strange coincidences that go on there too. Crazy house, that Gray Lady. We all sat in silence for a moment, transfixed by this part of Stephen's story. By now, Stephen had buried his head in his hands and was holding back tears. Savannah looked my way with a glance that I recognized as her signal that Stephen was the real deal and his story was about to get even more bizarre. I asked him to continue, and he told me what was truly troubling him. They had decided to move into the house despite the stories and rumors because they felt it was a deal they couldn't pass up. They rationalized all the spook stories and the choking tales as a small community's urban legend, and, like most intelligent types, they thought they'd find a solution to the house's history and after time dispel all the crazy notions of hauntings and a weird presence. The weird presence, I asked Stephen. Well, yes, that was the beginning. We were fine moving into the house. Our daughter Andrea loved her new room and we settled in rather quickly. But one evening at about 10 o'clock, after Andrea had gone to bed, we were watching TV when it began. Karen was dozing off and I wasn't far behind her. The room was dark except for the light from the TV, and I lowered the sound so as to not disturb Karen. But I then had the feeling that someone was in the room. You know that sense that someone's watching you? I almost didn't want to turn around, but something made me look. I sat up and turned my head slowly. At first I thought I had been half asleep, but then my eyes focused on Andrea at the top of the stairs and looking as though she was sleepwalking. She stood there not moving, and I asked her what she was doing out of bed and if she was all right. She looked at me with a dazed expression, raised her hand to her throat and said, "Daddy, my throat feels like it's closing. I need some water." Before I could get to the top of the stairs, Andrea fell to her knees, choking and gasping for air. I held her and tried to do CPR, but she began to turn blue. I called for Karen in a panic and could do nothing but shake Andrea in my arms as I tried to get her to respond. I was totally panicked, Stephen said. The little girl finally responded and recovered her breath. The relieved parents asked her if she was all right and were astounded by Andrea's response. She said to us that the man in her room brought her to the top of the stairs and said if we didn't destroy the house and the grounds, he would strangle her. Of course, we thought this was Andrea hallucinating from lack of oxygen, or maybe she had had a bad dream. We didn't press it right away because we didn't want to frighten her any more than she already was, Karen recounted. Andrea was checked by a physician and appeared fine. After a few days, her parents asked her about the man in her room. The young girl stuck to her story and claimed that she had heard a thump in her bedroom closet, and then an elderly man with a scruffy beard, disheveled white hair, and dressed in denim farmer's overalls had walked into her room. He was carrying a thick yellow rope, dirty and stained with a dark red, almost black substance that could have been dried oil or maybe blood, according to the child's description. Karen said that Andrea asked him who he was and what he wanted, but the man just took her by her hand and led her to the top of the stairs. That's when Stephen saw her and the choking began. We did all we could, doctors and psychologists, and we talked to Andrea constantly and assure her everything's okay. But now that things gotten even worse, we're at our wits' end. That's why we think there's a strange entity of some kind affecting our lives. I know it sounds like something out of a poltergeist movie, but Andrea has never lied to us. She had these choking things 3 more times, and we hear noises from the attic in the middle of the night. There's a bang, then walking sounds, and also some kind of creaking like a loose floorboard or a bending branch, Karen said. Silvana and I digested the couple's story that afternoon and told them we'd return the next day. We considered that maybe they were under some kind of suggestion hysteria caused by the town ghost stories. Silvana continued to believe that they were sincere based on all the psychic vibes she was getting, and we both agreed that they did not appear the type of people who would put their only daughter in jeopardy or make her the butt of a fabrication for the sake of some kind of notoriety. After all, they were financially comfortable and from all appearances were quite normal. The parents didn't want to put Andrea through any more drama than she had already experienced, so we agreed not to interview the girl but to take her parents' testimony at face value. The family had kept detailed notes comprising nearly 65 pages of Andrea's conversations with that old man. Each time she spoke to him, she said the apparition would begin to speak to her, but could never finish a sentence. He would literally be stuck on the words and could not explain himself, according to Andrea's reports. We had done some more field work and had discovered school records, compliment to Vincent's agency's crack detectives, that the 8-year-old was a very intelligent and perceptive child. Some reports indicated she often knew the answer to a question before her teacher would even ask it. Andrea was also prone to creating other worlds and fantasy people whom she claimed she conversed with and told her about things that were going to happen and things from the past that an 8-year-old couldn't possibly have known, to the astonishment of her teachers. Her precognitive abilities were categorized as simply being acute sensitivity and especially keen awareness of her environment, fancy terms for extrasensory perception. Silvana read between the lines and said that Andrea was apparently very gifted with PSI abilities, very much like when I was a little girl, Robert. So the question was no longer whether Andrea was experiencing a paranormal event, but from where it was originating. The facts pointed to local legends purporting choking incidents among former residents of the house, spontaneous choking with visible welts on Andrea's neck, sudden and continuous noises from the attic area over the girl's bedroom, and Andrea's own testimony regarding discussions with an old man with a rope just prior to her choking episodes. We reported back to Stephen and Karen that our investigation should continue, while Silvana and I staying at the house and using our equipment in an effort to capture what was troubling that family. We decided that we'd be introduced to Andrea's friends of the family who were going to spend the night. Fortunately, the guest bedroom was directly across from Andrea's room, which allowed us to set up cameras and sound recording instruments near the action. It was nearly dawn before Silvana awoke. We had spent the night in the room across from Andrea's and had not experienced anything unusual. I had stayed awake to monitor the equipment and occasionally peek in on Andrea as she slept. It was still dark outside when I saw the time was 4:58 a.m. on my digital watch. I was disappointed that we had come up with nothing, but then I reminded myself that in most of our investigations we spend days, sometimes weeks, before we solve the problem or close the case. I realized I was too anxious and was at least glad that Silvana had slept comfortably. I thought that maybe I should grab a few winks myself when suddenly Silvana awoke with a start and sat straight up in the bed. "It is here," she shouted. I stood up, startled, and asked her what she was talking about. She shushed me and said to listen. Dead silence. Savannah looked towards the ceiling as she pointed to the door. It is entering her room now, Robert, Savannah whispered. Listen, it is rumbling. The entity is awakening, Savannah said, emphasizing each hard letter in her full-on Czech accent. I listened hard and heard what sounded like a low banging coming from the attic. The sound changed to a shuffling and grew progressively louder. I checked the equipment to make sure everything was recording. We had microphones in the room along with a video monitor. We had also set up a remote control still camera outside of the house focused on the top of the house and the window of Andrea's room. Savannah rushed to the guest room door and pushed it open. The thing is here, she shouted. We ran across the hall and flung Andrea's door open to find the child in her bed, turned towards the window and speaking, What do you want me for? She said in a teary voice. By this time, Stephen and Karen had hurried to the room as well. I stopped them from rushing on to Andrea's side, asking that they wait just a moment and listen to their child's voice. I had to restrain Stephen's natural fatherly instinct to help his daughter, explaining that we were finally getting to the bottom of this problem. Savannah had become completely immersed in a trance, desperately trying to intercede with whatever was holding Andrea's attention, but the child kept crying and asking what the old man wanted. She was rocking back and forth on her bed, staring at the space between her and the bedroom window, its apparent emptiness bellied by the girl's intent focus. Daylight was beginning to break outside the window, and despite the noise we were making in her doorway, Andrea was oblivious to our presence. We managed to quiet down, and I glanced over at the equipment monitors to make sure everything was functioning properly. I was glad that I had remembered to activate the outdoor motion shutter release on the still Nikon camera before I had left the guest room. The camera was now snapping pictures of the house every 3 seconds. We could all hear Andrea speaking to whatever was in her room, but we couldn't make out any response. It was difficult keeping Karen quiet and back from her daughter's side. The woman kept praying to herself and asking how this could be happening to her little girl. Stephen finally convinced her to quiet down, and then we heard the entity speak. Between Andrea's sobs, a low, garbled voice became audible. At first, we weren't sure if it was Andrea speaking to herself in another voice or if it was in fact a foreign sound. But Savannah nodded to me, verifying that there was a paranormal event in progress and that we should be on high alert. The distinction between Andrea's voice and the grumbling became clear after a minute of conversation. Andrea asked what it wanted, and the voice responded with what sounded like, I am you gonna kill. Andrea interrupted and asked why I was making her feel bad and making her choke in front of her mommy and daddy. That was all about Karen could take. The distraught mother broke free of her husband's arms and rushed to her daughter's side, screaming at the top of her lungs, get away from my daughter, you thing, whatever you are, stop that goddamn evil stuttering and say what you want from us. You're not killing anyone here, you bastard. Stephen followed his wife to Andrea's side and hugged the girl along with Karen. During the confusion, I hadn't even noticed that Savannah had collapsed and hit the floor and was lying next to me, semi-conscious, apparently in a state of near exhaustion. I bent over to help her up, and she waved me off with a hand gesture. I looked around, stunned by what had just happened. Andrea was sobbing, but was comforted by her parents, who assured her that everything would be fine. The girl asked her parents if the man ran away, and if he got to tell them what he wanted to say. Karen and Stephen humored her as much as they could and said they would all go away and never come back. It was all a bad dream, they said, but as it turned out, the 8-year-old girl knew better. Later that day, we told Karen and Steve that we could not explain the night's events other than to say they had definitely been a paranormal event in the house. Savannah confirmed the presence and noted that it had left swiftly, but I warned them that that didn't mean the end of the problem. Unless we uncover something more, I advised that they move from the Gray Lady. We planned to stay another day in order to review the videotape and pick up the photos we had taken to the local photo shop for processing. The previous night, strange events unfortunately continued for us when we discovered that the videotape of Andrea's conversation was blank. There was no video or audio, just snow for most of the tape. As we walked to the photo shop, we turned over every possibility we could try to figure out what had gone wrong with the video equipment. It had never failed us before, so we chalked it up to yet another unexplained element of the case. At Jimmy's photo, the proprietor, a native of the area, handed us our prints taken by the auto shutter camera. He asked, "Interested in the old gray lady, huh?" I was as discreet as possible and said we liked unique architecture so as not to betray Karen and Stephen's confidence. "Well, the house sure has its history," he said. "How so?" "Well, you know it was about old Tom." "Old Tom?" I asked. "Yeah. The story was that old Tom, who they used to call the town idiot because he stuttered so much, went crazy and set his house afire on the very grounds where the Gray Lady stands today. They say that Tom's little girl choked and died from the smoke. Of course, then there's them who say old Tom couldn't warn his family about the fire because of his stuttering and all. Who knows about these crazy legends, huh, mister?" Jimmy said. As we left the store, Savannah and I waited for who would be the first one to say it. I broke down and asked Savannah if she thought Tom's ghost was simply trying to tell someone, anyone, that he had tried to save his family, and the choking was his way of dramatizing what had actually happened. Savannah half listened as she shuffled through the photos we just picked up from Jimmy. She stopped walking with one print in her hand and said, "Robert, look at this." In the photo, which was aimed directly at Andrea's window, there was a streaking apparition exiting the area. The apparition had the standard wisp-like appearance commonly associated with spirits captured on film. The timestamp correlated exactly with the time we had experienced the event in Andrea's room. "It looks like the ghost took off," I said. We showed Stephen and Karen the incredible photo and hypothesized that perhaps old Tom had finally gotten his message across and run off. We suggested that they tell everyone in town in hopes that the spirit would be satisfied that he was finally exonerated and would leave them in peace. It was a hard sell, and if they had not experienced the event in Andrew's room themselves, they would have probably dismissed us as lunatics. But they were desperate and agreed to try it out for a week or two. 2 months later, the family called investigations to tell us everything was fine. Andrea was recovering well, and there were no more disturbances. They did say, however, that they sometimes smell smoke, but that it's coming from the diner a few blocks away, at least they think. And then that's it. That's the end of Chapter 11, Andrea's Strangler, concluding essentially everything with Occult Investigator, Real Cases from the Files of X Investigations by Bob Johnson. So let's go ahead and let's talk about that here. First off, it looks like we finally have some finality with this final chapter, right? It seems like some of the other chapters had ambiguous endings. Here, though, in this case, we had this ghost who turned out to be potentially, but most likely old Tom. And then he in turn was the one that was haunting that poor young girl. And then finally it came to the conclusion that the reason why there was rumors about him and the fire were that either A, the fire was essentially caused, but he couldn't tell everyone about it, like his family about it because of his stuttering, or B, that the fire was caused by him. In other words, that it was something where him going so crazy that he set the house on fire and then either purposely or accidentally killed his family. It seems to be more like it's the former, because in this case, with them stating at the end that they wanted to share with everyone they talked to, in other words, the family sharing with others that it wasn't Tom's fault, that he in turn was trying to warn his family and so on, that was something that he wanted, that he liked, because concludingly it looks like he was not there anymore afterwards. But what a weird way of essentially trying to get someone's attention for that. All those other previous families encountering choking, that seems like a bizarre way of trying to convince someone that they aren't guilty of causing someone's harm by essentially harming that very person that they're telling, right? Doesn't seem like it's a good way to try to get that message across. But otherwise, it seems like this is a good case that showcases, again, a final mark for this final chapter here. And in this case, they finally had something along the lines of some physical evidence. Like in this case, that was really creepy when that ghost was making its presence known, how it alerted Savannah, how she could tell that it was up in the attic. There was rumbling, there was steps, there was some kind of noise being made as it was slowly descending into the room. Kind of gave me the shivers when I was thinking about it, because that stuff is creepy. You know it's coming and you can't really stop it. And so when it's there, it takes on a whole other level, especially when they finally went into that room and got to hear that ghost directly. They couldn't see it, but they heard it talking to the little girl, however brief it was. It's too bad that, again, there wasn't anything as far as any physical proof on video, even though that camera was facing there. It was just like a blank tape, but at least they were able to get some photos there too. But that's it. That's everything associated with this book. Check out the other chapters again if you have a chance. That way you'll get to hear or listen to again all those previous other chapters. I have a separate playlist for it available too. And then I'll probably do the missing chapter on the exclusive on the membership. So that way, if you wanted to check that out, you'll be able to see it sometime soon. I'll post, when it's up and running, I'll probably post it as an announcement too. All right, everybody. Thanks again as always. Take care. Bye.